I'd like to welcome you back to our studies. Today we're going to be beginning, not necessarily in the book of Haggai, but beginning to get into the story of Haggai. We're going to actually start the first two studies in this group will actually be a little bit about history around Haggai, kind of giving us an idea what led up to the prophet. And so it won't be actually be, there's only two chapters in Haggai. Obviously, it's a very short study. And this particular study is 4 parts. So it's the last 2 parts where we actually get into the book of Haggai. And so the first 2 parts of this study are going to be focusing on some background leading up to Haggai, why he existed and why he's important to us today. And so when we look in Revelations, which Revelations is very important. We're going to read a passage in Revelations here shortly. Revelations is very important because it gives us our prophetic future. It gives, things that have happened, but it also gives the future all the way up into and including the second coming of Christ and beyond. And so it gives us this passage that allows us to see the future and begin to understand it. But as we read part of Revelations, we see that there's these events happening. And these events actually have a parallel in the Old Testament. And so this all comes down to the trembling of nations. In a big way, there's a lot of people that really look forward to the second coming of Christ, but on an odd parallel track, they do not. They do not want him coming because he's going to shake up the world, and they don't want that. Of course, for some people who have been in Protestant Christianity for a long time, the thought of Christ coming back is this thought of us leaving this planet Earth. But that's not actually the narrative that I see unfolding in the Scriptures. What I see happening in the Scripture is this transition into Christ's kingdom when, yes, the world is going to be shook up. It's going to be shook up, and it needs to be shook up for many reasons. And many of those reasons we're beginning to see happening in the world today, where knowledge is being thrown out. Simple absolutes, mathematics and science are being set to the side, and we need to return to the truth. We need to return to the absolutes that really are Christ. As it says, he is the way, the truth, and the light. And that's very important. And so what we expect is this trembling of nations. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, going back into the Babylonian captivity period, which is very important to think about. It says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years. Wherefore the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So, God's people had to pass through this period of time of chastisement. We know from the story of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar came in, actually his father before him. They began conquering most of what we would call the Middle East, and Nebuchadnezzar came in and finished that work with the conquering of Jerusalem. Actually, several different times he came in and took captives back to Babylon before he finally basically destroyed completely Jerusalem. But the prophecies in Jeremiah is that this will not be forever. There's a period of time when God's people will be chastised, and then that period of time ends. And for them, this is a 70 years of desolation. Now that's important to think about because that's really backing us up before Haggai, because Daniel's not even in captivity yet, and Haggai is much later in time. But what this gives us is an idea of how things are progressing. Now, why is the exile in Babylon important? Well, let's go into Revelations 17 and 18 and get a picture of what's before us. By getting an understanding of what's before us prophetically, we can begin to put the two histories together. So let's start out Revelations chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, and I will show thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away into the spirit, into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet-colored beast, full of blasphemies, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornications. And upon her forehead was a name written, and this is important, Mystery. You'll notice there's a comma after mystery. It's because it's not part of the actual name. It is giving us an understanding. In the Old Testament, Babylon was a nation. It was a place you could mark on the map. You could go there in the Middle East and visit if you wanted to. Today, there is no place called Babylon. It was destroyed. The center, the capital, effectively in ruins. And this is important. This is why the mystery is here. Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of the harlots and the abomination of the earth. And I saw a woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. If this was purely a geographical location, I believe God would have given us a better understanding. But the idea to me between chapter 17 and between chapter 18 is that we have 2 pieces to Babylon. This first piece here is depicted by a woman. Typically speaking in the scriptures, we find that when it is speaking prophetically of a woman, it is oftentimes speaking of the church of God's people. And so here we have a woman, but this is not a righteous woman. This is a woman full of fornication. This is a woman who does not have a husband. This is a woman who may have many men, very different. The church has one husband and God has one wife. And that's important to remember. Here we have something that is outside of the bonds of normal matrimony. And so in Babylon, in the idea of the title of Babylon, you have 2 big parts. One of those big parts is the religious side. And it's not just religion in general, it's the religious industry. The act of selling religion, selling the gospel, selling all of it. It's a money market scheme. We do it like Hollywood does their movies. And that is one side of Babylon. It is this religious market that's all about the money and what it can make for you. And of course it says here she's drunk with the blood of the saints. Unfortunately, blood is our living, the living liquid of our substance. Without blood we die. And so this institution, this religious institution, is thriving and living off of the life force of true believers, oftentimes because true believers are supporting it without thinking. And, that's one of the things we need to back off of. This is not just speaking of a country martyring, killing all Christians. No, this is talking about a country, Babylon, which didn't kill all of her Christians, but rather made them into a money marketing scheme. And we can see a lot of the big MLMs, multi-level marketing schemes today, are based around religious principles and ideas. And this is one of the parts of this mystery Babylon. Now, the other part of this mystery Babylon is in the industrial world complex. It's not just about building or producing or industry. It's about that part of industry that is there solely for the purpose of living off of the poorest of the people. It's taking advantage, because that's what both of these are. Both of these pieces that we will be seeing are to take advantage of the poorest, the most innocent, the least educated, not just them, but they are the bulk of the world today. And that's unfortunate to say, but it is true. We have more third world countries than first world countries, and there's a reason. And so the idea is this mystery, this Babylon the Great, is living off the backs of all of that. And so the kings who succeeded Nebuchadnezzar II, who's actually his full name, well, not his full name, but his title, Nebuchadnezzar II, were much less capable than him, Nebuchadnezzar, and had rather short reigns. In the decade that followed Nebuchadnezzar II's death, the Neo-Babylonian Empire had 4 different rulers. The last of whom was Nabonidus, who reigned from 556 BC to the fall of Babylon in 539 BC. And so the importance of this is because we're trying to line up 2 stories. An Old Testament story about Babylon where Daniel's existing, and today this new great Babylon where we, across the scope of the world, because the prophecies of Revelation aren't just for Israel. They aren't just for the United States. They aren't just for Russia. They aren't just for one country. They're for the whole of the world. And that's important. That's why it's called a mystery, because most people can't understand that this is a world thing, international, without borders. And so what we have here is we've got to line up these 2 stories. Nebuchadnezzar II is the Old Testament story. We are now in the New Testament story with this new Babylon the Great. But just like them, during the, when Nebuchadnezzar was coming to the end of his period of time and these other rulers were beginning to reign, concluding with Nabonidus, we have in Old Testament this call to God's people. It's time to leave Babylon. Remember, they were only supposed to be there for 70 years. That's it. Now they're supposed to get out. And so God calls to his people, but, it's not easy to disconnect from the system. If we think back to the story when Israel was in Egypt, and of course, they were enslaved by the pharaohs, and they were put to horrendous work. Their firstborn sons were killed. There was all these things that were happening that made it just an unbearable situation. But when the people called out to God, he listened. He sent in Moses and eventually took the people out. When the people were beginning their journey out, what happened? Were they thankful? Were they grateful? Were they shouting with joy in festivities because they had finally garnered freedom? No, they weren't. They were complaining. They were complaining because their life as slaves was a life of known. They knew what was going to happen in the morning when they woke up. They knew, paraphrasing kind of, so to speak, history, they knew they were going to get up, have their coffee, go to work. There was going to be, food, meat in the pot it talked about. All of these knowns were there. And even though it was unbearable, they didn't want to leave. And of course, what did they tell Moses? We want to go back. I can't imagine someone in prison being let free and saying, nope, I don't want freedom. I want to go back. But that's the truth of most of the prisons in the world also, and people who are sent to prisons for a long period of time. They adapt to the prison life, and when you let them out into freedom, they can't survive. And so God's people are called out of Old Testament Babylon, and they're not really all that excited to go because Babylon is nice. Now, one of the main differences between the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar's period of time and Egypt of Joseph's time and later is that Egypt took God's people and turned them into slaves, hardcore slaves. And that was a hard life. Babylon, they used a little bit more tactic in that, if we remember, Nebuchadnezzar took some of the princes of Jerusalem, trained them in Babylonian language and Babylonian ways, and then put them in the government. And so now you have, again, the God's people being made slaves, but it doesn't seem like slavery. Because even though they're in Babylon, they have a measure of freedom, a measure of power. Daniel got in there. He got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into government positions. They were overseers of large swaths of land in Babylon. And you think about that for a minute. How could Babylon not have prospered and become a world power with true believers in the government? And yet, Babylon still becomes destroyed. Why? Because at the core of Babylon was not righteousness. And this is important to remember. And so Babylon had a purpose. And it didn't matter how many good people were in government, it wasn't going to change that. It had to be destroyed. And so we today are also being called out of Babylon. This Babylon that isn't just one nation, one government, but this Babylon that is all encompassing in the world. And so when we were looking at that Revelations chapter 17, we saw some things that were important. God was coming to judgment, just like he did in Daniel's time. He came to judgment against Babylon. And Babylon, as it is depicted in 17, I saw a woman. Again, this is a religious piece of Babylon. Now, if we jump forward to the next chapter, in chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, and of course, this whole chapter is important to understanding the other side of Babylon, the industrial complex. But if we just look at 1 through 5 for a moment, it says, "And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lighted with the glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. And the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that you receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities." So now you have this overall view of the fall of Babylon. And that's really important. But in verse 1, we have a piece here that's exceptionally important. It says, "The earth was lighted with his glory." So when we talk about light, light is often another word for Christ, for the truth. All of these things come together, synonymous. And so when the earth is lighted with his glory, it's Jesus Christ's glory, the angel's glory, we know that there is truth and light here on the earth. That's where we come in as believers. We are called to be light. And light means not that we're just disseminating all information, but that we're helping getting the absolute truth out. That means we have to know what the truth is. Because if I'm sharing what I like, my political preferences, my whatever, I'm not sharing truth. I'm sharing me. And this isn't about me. This is about Jesus Christ. So our job is to share truth, light. Says verse 2, "And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, is become a habitation of devils, and a hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine and the wrath of her fornications." Everyone is participating. This is a global activity. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. This is a global activity. There's a market here. Again, like I said, there's two pieces to this. Chapter 17, the religious side of it, which encompasses many, but there is one great whore who is the mother of the rest of the whores. And then we have the second side, which is spoken of below verse 5 in chapter 18, which is the industrial complex that begins to fall apart. And that's important to keep in mind because both of these legs are falling out from under Babylon. Babylon is falling. It will be crushed. And we need to think about how that's going to affect us as individuals. And so what does God tell us? The same thing he told. This Revelation 17 and 18 could have been prophecies given to God's people in Babylon back in the time of Daniel. It could have been, but it's not. Babylon, at the time of Revelations, when John's writing Revelations by inspiration, Babylon the Great is gone. It's been destroyed. And so we have in verse 4, "And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partaker of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached the heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities." That's so vitally important. We're being called out of all of this global industrial complex, the idea that we can get ahead in this world off the sweat and blood of our brothers and sisters. off the people around us. That's not the way we get ahead. That's not the way God intended it. We're not intended to live off the problems, the weaknesses, the ignorance of other people. And that's what this is all about. It's about this ignorance that doesn't allow people to find the truth. And so it's calling us to not be partaker in that sin. It's telling us to come out of it because they're going to be destroyed, and it's going to be painful. And if we're not in it, then we won't feel that particular pain. Albeit, while it's coming down, we may suffer some pain. You know, it's one of those things where the closer that you are to the center of a nuclear explosion, for example, the more affected you will be. And so we know Babylon's coming down. What that means is the closer I live to the proximity of the center of that destruction, the more it's going to affect me as an individual, the more it's going to affect my family. Do I love my family? Do I love my kids? Do I love my grandkids? I need to think about that. And so, if I want the best possible outcome, I have to move away from that center of Babylon. I need to get out of it. I need to remove myself from it because that's not part of what is good, right, and just. And so as I move out of it, I find that my life becomes a better life. I am happier, my family is happier. And as Babylon crumbles, I'm not in as dangerous a position. So the farther I move out of Babylon, the farther I move out of the eye of the hurricane, so to speak, the less danger there will be for me. And of course, like a tornado, like a hurricane, we know that they affect certain places. If you get on the outsides of that, you'll be the least affected. And so there's some wisdom to be thought of in this passage. But this is what it's calling. And like I said, this could have been a prophecy given to the house of Israel in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. But it wasn't. It was given to the New Testament church when Babylon itself was gone. And so one of our characters that's important in our story when we're talking about Haggai is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the last of the good rulers of the house of Israel. As you go through all the house of Israel looking for someone to begin making a migration back to Israel, to Jerusalem, with the core people who want to go back, Zerubbabel is the guy that rises up. Now, according to the biblical narrative, Zerubbabel was governor of the province of the Archemedian Empire, Yehud Medinata, and he was the grandson of Jeconiah, the penultimate king of Judah. Zerubbabel led the first group of Jews, about 42,360, roughly speaking, who returned from Babylonian captivity in the first year of Cyrus the Great, the king of the Achaemenid Empire. The date is generally thought to have been about 538 to 520 BC. Zerubbabel also laid the foundation for the Second Temple in Jerusalem soon after. In all the accounts of the Hebrew Bible that mention Zerubbabel, he's always associated with the high priest who returned with him, Joshua, or Jeshua, son of Jehozadak. Together, these two men led the first wave of Jews who returned from exile and began to rebuild the temple. And so that's really important in our story. We've got this man, Zerubbabel, who stands up and brings the first group back. Not many went back compared to those who were there. And as we take note of the story, they're going back during the reign of Cyrus the Great. So Babylon has already been attacked by the Medes and the Persians. It's already fell. But we know that when Cyrus the Great came in, he didn't just destroy Babylon. He took it over, and it became part of the Mede and Persian Empire. It's not till much later that we find that the city and Babylon itself is destroyed. People still always existed. Chaldeans, all the people around there that existed to a great degree always exist there. And so down in their core, there's genetics till today of the Chaldeans that live there, descendants from the people that we're talking about in one way or another. But the kingdom falls, and that's important. And so we're already seeing we're into the fall of Babylon. It's already fell. In other words, the very announcement that we saw in Revelation chapter 18, Babylon has fallen, that's already taken place in the Old Testament story when Zerubbabel decides to leave. Cyrus the Great is in power, and he's the one who actually gives the people the green light to return. And of course, as they return under Zerubbabel, and many events happen, we'll be talking about some of those, we have this prophet rise up, who is Haggai. Who is Haggai? Haggai was a Hebrew prophet during the building of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and one of the 12 minor prophets in the Hebrew Bible, and the author of the book of Haggai. He's known for his prophecies in about 520 BCE, commanding the Jews to rebuild the temple. His name means my holidays. He was the first of 3 post-exile prophets from the Neo-Babylonian exile of the house of Judah, with Zechariah, his contemporary, and Malachi, who lived about 100 years later, who belonged to the period of Jewish history which began after the return from captivity at Babylon. So Zerubbabel returns with the first group and begins rebuilding the temple. And we'll get more into that as we progress in the study. Haggai comes in after that first group. And that's important to remember in the course of our story. We have another important person in this story. We're not going to get into him particularly a whole lot, Ezra, but we will read in the book of Ezra, because in the beginning of the book of Ezra, we actually have the beginning of our story, which brings us to Haggai. And so our first real reading is actually going to be out of the book of Ezra, the leading up to why Haggai was there and preaching. Now, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one scroll. And some Bibles have that in Nehemiah 3:32 as a footnote. Later, the Jews divided the scroll and named it 1st and 2nd Ezra. Modern Hebrew Bibles call the 2 books Ezra and Nehemiah, as do other modern translations of the Bible. Some parts of the book of Ezra, chapters 4:8 to 6:18 and chapter 17, verses 12 through 26, were written in Aramaic, and the majority in Hebrew, with Ezra himself being expert in both languages. Ezra, descendant of the high priest Sariah, was living in Babylon when in the 7th year, 457 BC approximately, of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, the king sent him to Jerusalem to teach the laws of God to anyone who did not know them. Ezra led another group, because we know Zerubbabel led the first group. Behind Zerubbabel comes other people, and Ezra is one of them. Ezra led a large number of exiles back to Jerusalem, where he discovered that Jewish men had been marrying non-Jewish women. He tore his clothes in despair and confessed the sins of Israel before God, then challenged the oppression of some of his own countrymen to the opposition of some of his own countrymen to purify the community by enforcing the dissolution of sinful marriages. A few years later, Artaxerxes sent Nehemiah, another group, a Jewish nobleman in his personal service, to Jerusalem as governor with the task of rebuilding the city walls. Once this task was complete, Nehemiah had Ezra read the law of Moses, the Torah, to the established Israelites, and the people and the priests made a covenant to keep the law and separate themselves from all other people. So what we have is a progression in a story here. But the part of this story that is most important to us today is what happens right before Haggai and Haggai, because that's the pocket of time that we're living in. The call to come out of Babylon, the leaving of Babylon, and the building of God's temple. So Ezra, the reality of it is still ahead of us in our period of time, and Nehemiah even farther ahead from that. And so there's this process. Now, as we're looking at this Old Testament story, we're looking at a story that's speaking of physical things, the rebuilding of a physical temple, the rebuilding of the physical walls in the city. all these things that were part of the Old Testament. As we read these and compare them to our time, we need to think about more spiritual events, because most of this, in its prophetic language, is speaking spiritually to us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that also as we get through here. We understand that we, the believers, are the temple of God. And so there's this temple foundation that has been laid. But the rest of the temple has not been finished. And that's what we're tasked to do with Haggai. We're tasked, first off, to leave Babylon. And then we're tasked that we might rebuild the temple. And that's important. So we have really five pieces to our story here that are important. In the beginning, of course, we have the fall of Babylon itself, which we can find in the book of Daniel, Daniel 9:2 specifically, when this happens. But we have the fall of Babylon. After the fall of Babylon, we have Zerubbabel, who returns with the first group of people, and we have his story in the book of Ezra, which we're going to be reading. And then about 520 BC, approximately, Haggai shows up as a prophet and begins prophesying to the people. And we'll be reading that when we start the first chapter of Haggai. After Haggai comes Ezra, and Ezra returns. His purpose is to come back and help reestablish the law of God, the truth. This is his purpose. So he's coming back into the picture. I would almost think that in some way Ezra is kind of a typification of Christ to a degree, because he's bringing back the absolute truth and correcting the people to a degree. And so as we're looking at this, there's the Haggai point, which, I can't really say what it is particularly, but there's a Haggai point in here where we're called to build the temple. Zerubbabel is a point that is actually to a degree behind us. We had our Zerubbabel come and we built the foundation of the temple, and we're building the foundation of the temple. But now our Haggai moment comes when we need to be animated to finish our temple. And then our Ezra moment will come in the future, which is when the truth, the law of Christ, is brought back, and brought back in its clarity and in its purity, which is very important. And then the Nehemiah point, where we actually finish off the work. And so our focus right now in the Haggai study is just going to be in those first three: the fall of Babylon, Zerubbabel, and Haggai, and not even so much in the fall of Babylon, except that that's our period, because like it's said in Revelations, which is about where we are. If you have followed the studies I've done on YouTube, there is an older study called The End of the Era. And in that study, we talked about a revelation given through Apostle Brian McIndoe, in which he is given to understand that the last cup, the last vial of chapter 16 of Revelations, is what we're actually in the middle of and moving out of right now, with, of course, the fall of hail, the financial burden that comes with that seventh vial being poured out. And so there's these taxing things that are happening, and there's a parallel to all of this in Babylon. There was these things happening that were beginning to tax God's people, which helped motivate the first group to leave. And so this is what we're going to be paralleling to in our study. And so we have also been given a call to build, just like the house of Israel was. They were called to rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel went back, again, under the commandment of Cyrus the Great, which is one of the only examples we have biblically. It's a very wild example, in my opinion, because Cyrus the Great was actually termed in the Hebrew a Messiah, a Savior. And so, but he wasn't, as far as we know, in any way a believer. Now, there's a lot of his history that we obviously don't know anything about, but the important thing is to remember that this guy, who, as far as we know, was outside of the church, was calling God's people up to a higher calling. And so Zerubbabel took the first group back, 42,000, and began. Now, as before we actually get into Ezra and start thinking about it, we need to bring in this parallel of our own rebuilding. And so 3rd Nephi chapter 9, verses 80 and 81, and then 85 and then 93. You're welcome to read through all of these verses, and the ones in between that I'm skipping. But the purpose for reading these is that we might look and see the parallel in these to what we're talking about, the call to come out of Babylon. These very words could have been given prophetically to the house of Israel in physical Babylon in the Old Testament. And so this is what it says, verse 80. For ye shall not go out with haste, nor go by flight, for the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel shall be your rearward. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. And of course, comparing it to the Old Testament passage, we might put in here Zerubbabel. My servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and very high. Verse 85. Then shall this covenant which the Father hath covenanted with his people be fulfilled. And then shall Jerusalem be inhabited again. You see, this coming out of Babylon, Zerubbabel and the first group are coming back. They're beginning to build the temple. They're rebuilding their houses. And we'll see this as we get into Haggai. They rebuild their homes, their houses, their properties, their own personal stuff. And then shall Jerusalem be inhabited again with my people, and it shall be the land of their inheritance. Verse 93. And when these things come to pass, that thy seed shall begin to know these things, it shall be a sign unto them, that they may know that the work of the Father hath already commenced, unto the fulfilling of the covenant which he hath made unto the people which are of the house of Israel. And so by the time it gets to our understanding of what's really happening, we're already well down the path, okay? That is oftentimes true. It's true about much of prophecy. About the time it finally dawns on us, the light bulb goes off, where we are prophetically, we're already well into the prophecy, maybe even sometimes on our way out. And that's important to remember also. And so then we jump down to verse 99. And my people, which are a remnant of Jacob, shall be among the Gentiles. Yea, in the midst of them, as a lion among the beasts of the forest, as a young lion among the flocks of sheep, who if he go through, both treadeth down and teareth in pieces, and none can deliver. And so you have this mix of God's people, even with unbelievers. But even though we're mixed, and this is important for us to remember, because in the Old Testament, they were physically told to come out of Babylon. It was a physical location. The Babylon that Revelations is speaking of for us is not necessarily a physical location. It's a mentality that is global. And so even though we're living still in the midst of the Gentiles, we're still called to come out of Babylon. Babylon the Great, this mentality. We need to change it. And that's what this is talking about. And now if we jump down into chapter 10 of 3rd Nephi, verses 2 through 4, it says, And also as many of the house of Israel as shall come, that they may build a city which shall be called the New Jerusalem. So here we have this parallel, as I was talking about, with Zerubbabel coming out, beginning the rebuilding of the city, beginning laying the foundation for the temple. Then you have after him Haggai coming in, animating the people to finish the temple. You have Ezra coming in, reestablishing the absolute purity of the law. And after that, you have Nehemiah coming in, finishing up the building of the city. This is what we're talking about here prophetically through the story of the Old Testament. Verse 3, And then shall they assist my people, that they may be gathered in, which are scattered upon all the face of the land, in unto the New Jerusalem. So already God's people are everywhere scattered. And the scattered in this verse, to me, my understanding of it is that it's less geographical and more, again, a mindset. And so I believe that out there in the world, there's another passage in the Old Testament of the Book of Mormon that talks about all the other churches. And it makes this reference that even in the other churches, there are humble followers of Jesus Christ. They're scattered. They don't know where the truth is. They need to be brought in. And that's what I'm seeing here. Because geographically, we're still throughout all the world. We need to be. But we are called into action, and we're called to bring all the people in. Verse 4, and then shall the power of heaven come down among them, and I also will be in the midst. We have Christ coming. And so you have this work being done, and sorry, been fighting a long time with allergies. Anyway, so you have this work happening that has been happening, is happening, and in comes the Messiah in his second coming. And then shall the work of the Father commence at that day, even when this gospel shall be preached among the remnant of this people. And so there's still a group out there that haven't reached the truth. They haven't heard it. We've been going out, we've been calling in, and the New Jerusalem is beginning, which is to me also a mentality, the New Jerusalem. And so we've been building the New Jerusalem. We're establishing it. We're changing the way we think. We're changing the way we live. We're calling people up to a higher calling. Christ comes in, and yet there's still people out there that we've never gotten to. A lot of people think that we will preach the gospel to every single person, so to speak, before Christ's second coming. That's not really what this passage indicates. This passage actually indicates when Christ comes, we will then be going out to some of the lost tribes who are still lost. They're still gone. They haven't got the truth. And that's important for us to think about. And so this is kind of, wraps up the first part of this, gives us the overview of the beginning coming up to the prophecy of Haggai. In the second study, as I mentioned, we'll be getting into the book of Ezra. If you want to read ahead in the first 5-6 chapters, roughly speaking, we will be covering pieces of it, not all of it, in the next study with Zerubbabel's return, and just kind of familiarizing ourselves with the story so we can understand what it is that's happening today in the world. And I hope this helps you, and I hope this animates you also to know that God is doing his work. He has not forgotten his people. He has not forgotten anything. Everything's going ahead just as planned. And the end of the story has already been written. No matter how much fear, no matter how much doubt, no matter how much we look at the world and wonder what in the world's happening, the end of the story has already been written. And we can have confidence in that. God knows what he's doing. And we can rest at ease, knowing his plan is happening. The only thing we need to do is be praying and fasting and asking, what's our part in this story? What part do I play? Zerubbabel's going to go back. The beginning of the building of God's people is happening. What part do each one of us play in this story? And I think that's very important to be asking right now, because things are moving pretty fast right now. And like I said, before you know it, we'll be on the outside of this prophecy, heading out, and the light will just be dawning on us, and it'll be too late for us to be a real integral part. I mean, if you think about just what we've overviewed right now, the people who came back with Nehemiah did not take part in rebuilding the temple. And that's an interesting thing to think about. Now, where do you want to fall in? I know it's hard to come out of Babylon. I know it's hard to come out of that mentality. It's been so ingrained into us. And Babylon is such a rich place with so much potential, and we do not want to leave it. But where do you want to fall in? Do you want to come back with Zerubbabel? Do you want to come back with Haggai? Do you want to come back with Ezra? Do you want to come back with Nehemiah? Each one of those had a different part to play, and each one of those also brought back people at a different point. And so I highly recommend you to continue to reading, like I said, Ezra and Haggai, and dedicate a lot of time to prayer and fasting to ask God what your part in this story is. I want to thank you for spending this time and studying with me. May God bless you, and may you have a wonderful day.